Welcome everybody, you're watching Mr. Fugu Data Science. Today we're doing an introduction to pandas. If you're familiar with pandas, this is not the video for you. Before we get started, I'd like to say thank you to the new subscribers and recent viewers. If you've never used pandas, but maybe you're familiar with R, for example, this is used for data frame manipulations and reading in files. So let's get into importing our pandas, where I alias as PD. The first file I'm calling in will be my recruiter candidates file I've used in previous videos. So we're doing a PD, and then we're doing a read CSV, and then the file name, we call that in. We have a second file which I'll name CPU sales. This would be similar, but instead of CSV, it's a pickle file, showing you that you can also call in different file types. We'll view this data in a second. Now, let's look at something that's interesting, alright? Let's take in some online sales data that we used in previous videos for the R project that we created. And we're going to notice something in a second. So let's read this in and scroll down. I intentionally show this because I want you to note something interesting. It says Unicode decode error UTF-8, and you say, oh man, and it's at some specific byte location, and you say, oh man, what's going on with this? So we scroll back up here, we zoom right back in, and we go back to this file that I used in the R. If you notice right here, this is a R markdown file, and this file opens up correctly. But when you're using pandas, it gives you a big old nope. So you have to change the encoding. And for this specific file, it's going to be an ISO 88959-1 should read this one in. And then I left a link right here. So if you're interested in looking at the different codecs, just in case you get this encoding error, you'll be fine and dandy. But something interesting, what if you actually don't know what the encoding is for this specific file? Well, there's a fine and dandy function that I found, or I shouldn't say function, you could create this into a function. But somebody made this where they're actually iterating through the file, looking at the encoding, and allowing you to print off all the encoding types that would work for this file type, which is really useful. Because if you are in a situation where you actually looked specifically at this file and you printed this off to figure out the file type, it says encoding UTF-8, and you say, oh dang it, this sucks, because that's the error that we were getting above. So this right here would be very useful, because these are all the coding types that you can use. Alright, now if you want to inspect your data, you could do a few things. You can look at the head of it, which are the first 5 lines. You could also specify here if you don't want 5 and you want actually more. You can look at the end. You can also try to figure out what are the data types of your columns of your data, which is really useful, which will come up in a second. We can also use sorting of our values, so we can get into sorting. So let's sort our CPU sales. And you'll have sort by index and values. We're going to use values real quick. And what we need to do is call in something. So what do we have? We have this by, and we have an axis. You can sort by rows or by column, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to first just sort by the purchase date. Wait, let's look at this real quick. Let's get all the columns. So I have my, okay. So you can use this little nice function to actually figure out how this is spelled, because I was just about to put a capital when I did not need to do that. Okay, so this sort by our purchase date. But what if we were curious and said, well, what did this originally look like? So let's go here, let's get the head of that, let's create a new line, and now we can notice that we did sort by the date. But you also have the opportunity of sorting by more than one column. So if you wanted to first sort by the date and then you wanted to do the CPU, let's do that. So we first did by the purchase date, followed by sorting by the CPU in the order that this came, alright? We have other functionality where we can create a new column and basically concatenate it onto our existing data. So let's do that. Let's take our online retail data, and what are we going to do with this? We're going to take 2 columns and multiply them together. So I first want to take my quantity and multiply that by the unit price, so we can get that. We can also do this a separate way, where we do the online retail data and we could do a dot, we could do the quantity times, we do the same thing, and this is two different ways to do the same thing. Alright, now what happens when you just print off one of these by itself? Let's figure out what this actually is. So let's figure out what the type is, and it's called a Panda Series. And a Panda Series is basically, just think of one column, like a 1D array that you're taking out of your 2D data frame, where it's your rows and columns. Alright, so let's take in what we just made. We need to call in our data frame, but we're creating a new column, which would be your, I don't know, total price. So then we could print this off, and notice that we have indeed our total price here. So let's shorten this up. So now we have a new column that you can add on. You can also subset your columns, so let's do that. And you have two different types of subsetting. You have indexing based and you have name based. So what does that really mean? So let's take the online retail again, and let's do some subsetting real quick with the locate, LOC, loc, or lock, depending on how you want to call it. So let's say I only want the first 3 rows, and then I want to call 2 specific columns, just arbitrarily choosing columns right now. So we can subset this way. We could also do index based, so that's just plug and chug this again, and let's do it by index. And what do I mean by the index? So let's just say we want one row, which is row number 3, and then let's just take column number 3, and that's the value that was there. But then let's say we want all of the columns from 3 onward, and that's what we get. And this is the specific value that you're going to get. Pardon me. These values come from the specific row of number 3. So we could play around with this, and now what we have is from row 3 to 7, where we are taking columns from 3 to the end. And I want to note something. Index bases are starting from 0, okay? So I want you to take note of that. Also, this is taking from 0 and stopping at 1. So that's why number 1 is not shown here, alright? We also can do something else which is a little interesting, which you'll see. So let's do this, where we're taking the location based, and let's just take the first 3 rows again, but let's do something interesting with this. So let's take a range of named values, and let's just say we want it to the customer ID for some reason, right? So you can also do this range of values with these name based, but if you did this with the index location, it doesn't work. Alright, so that's something you need to take into consideration. So now, just check for some null values. And there's 4 specific ways that I'm showing in this example. Alright, so let's take our online sales stuff once again. And let's take the columns where we were calling in the data once again. And we're looking for the null values. And we're trying to find any nulls. And these are the 2 specific columns that do have nulls. Now let's check and find all columns, print it out a true or false to see if indeed they have any null values. So we can just cut and paste this, and that's what you get printed off here. We can also take a count and find how many null values we have. So we will take the online retail again, and then we need to do all of this inside of it. And then this is going to look a little redundant, but we're also going to take this now and then sum it. And so now we figured out we have this many null values within this specific column, this many for this specific column, which is very useful. Well, what else can we do? We can take these data and we can look for is.na, and then we can do .any, but now we're going to do it by rows, okay? So now we're printing off all the rows which have null values, and here's the row numbers, all right? And you'll see all of these. And if we scroll down, you can see that there's quite a bit of rows that have null values that you'd have to take care of. And more likely than not, this is a big issue here, okay? You could also do formatting. Let me just show something real quick, which is something I wanted to do, but there's something very particular about this column, something I wanted to show. If you look at this is a customer ID, but it's getting printed off as a float, which is a problem. So then you tell yourself, well, so it's getting printed off as a float, and you tell yourself, well, that's not correct, you have to change this. But if you just notice what we showed above, then you see that you have a bunch of null values, or nans, that you would need to take care of, okay? Now what I can do is also you're able to manipulate dates. So let's first get into this. So if we're looking into playing with the date, let's pull this invoice date and see what's going on. So if we look at the type, what does this tell us? Well, we're dealing with the series. So that's not what we want to do. We want to look at the data type. The data type is an object here, all right? But we need to change that into an actual date. So if we're to do any type of manipulations later, it'll work. So we need to do a conversion, which would be the date time, and we need to call in our invoice. And then what do? Well, let's do an infer the date time format, and let's do that equal to true. So what does that do? So let's check now. And if you notice this weird kind of formatting, it doesn't make any sense until you Google it. And it just has to deal with this being a date time formatting that we just changed it to, which is interesting because now you have the opportunity here. If you see this .dt, we're able to call the date time, and I could pull the month. So here I could pull the month, and you can pull whatever you want here and create new columns to extend it on if you're doing any type of analysis or plotting. Okay, we can also find the duplicated values, which are really useful and necessary quite often. So to do this is very simple, where we just call in duplicated, print that off, and these are all of the rows that were duplicate rows within this data. And depending on what you need to do, you may need to remove these, or you may need to make some comparisons. I don't really know, it just depends on your situation. And so I basically wanted to show you this little video for those who have never used Pandas before, and to get a handle on some basic functionality. I could spend probably the next year going on different functions, but these are some common ones that you should probably look into, which will come up in your data quite often. Alright? As always, I would like to say like, share, and subscribe, and if you do, please turn on that notification bell. I hope this brought utility to someone. See you in the next video. Bye.